Hey guys, it's Penelope in London, and I'm looking at today self-compassionate reparenting. And when we've been through trauma and we've had a parent that's not raised us around joy or some form of ability, showing us how to self-actualize, where we've been raised very much by sort of dead parenting, where the parents have not been active, or whether we've received hardcore trauma, either sexual abuse or disdain, or, the way we were spoken to, or even if we've been bullied in childhood. And it doesn't have to be our parental care, it can be early carers. And the imprints stay stuck and they become frozen. We have arrested development and we have many issues. Pete Walker talks about this in his book, Complex PTSD, From Surviving to Thriving, which I highly recommend with all of the people that, that I do this work with, to purchase that book and check it out on Audible. I think it's free in one format. And this book is another of his books, and I'm going to read chapter 9, and the page number is going to be page 205. I'm going to read a couple of pages, not all of it. But before I do that, I'm just going to go forward a couple of slides and just explain something to you, and then come back to reading this book. So what we have is that Pete Walker talks about trauma responses, and we have what's called, if you see on this screen, fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And as a result of this, when we get triggered, we can go into one of these fight, flight, freeze, fawn responses. And this can mean that we are basically highly activated. In fight, we tend to be, it's like more of a narcissistic response, a temporary narcissistic response. There's a lot that flies around about narcissism that's not helpful to people that have been through abuse, because people can think they're narcissistic, but ultimately it's a temporary response. A true narcissist will be somebody that has absolutely no empathy. They just don't contain empathy in any situation. So when we're looking at the fight, flight, freeze, fawn, we want to identify, we probably had one or two responses that we used as a child. For me as an adult, I went into more of the fight, flight, and I would sometimes freeze. So we can see that fight is anger outburst, controlling, the bully, narcissistic, explosive behavior. And then we've got flight, which is workaholic, overthinker, anxiety, panic, OCD, difficulty sitting still, perfectionist. And freeze is difficulty with decisions, stuck, disassociation, isolating, and feeling numb. Fawn is where we're a people pleaser. It's a lack of identity. It's no boundaries. It's overwhelm, and it's codependency. So we can probably all see parts of this in us, but when we go into trigger mode, we need to understand how we get out of that. I'm also getting rid of the inner critic, which is the perfectionism, which we will often, maybe if we weren't loved, then we will go out of our way to be perfect and think there's something wrong with us. We don't know how to love ourselves. And that interject, that taking that on from parents, we then will also project that into the world outside ourselves. So the next slide. This is really important to understand that a sense of self-worth is necessary for us to protect ourselves. And we really need to look at our sense of self-worth, because if we've not been taught our self-worth, because that's what happens when we're a baby, that one-to-one mirroring will teach us our self-worth. Again, we have the problem with if a child, trauma, people think trauma is just where horrible things happen to people. Trauma is also where a child is over-adulated or over-idolized and told that they're the king of the world, or she's the princess and she's going to save the world, or he's going to save the world, whatever the parent does, through over-adulating, and also giving the child more than, enough, but over the top in love. And they also, it's where the parents don't let the child go. The guy will, for instance, not, have a successful marriage, as the female will be looking for the perfect daddy. It causes chaos, as well as, that trauma. So it's trauma. That's basically whatever way we look at this. Relationships thriving over time, which is really important, our relationship with ourselves, but our relationship with others. So what society has taught us, and we may all know this because I certainly do, that you know, we all strive for that romanticism, the date nights, and the finding the guy or the girl, you know, depending on where we're at. And then we have, you know, the idea that we're going to have a home and start a family. This is imprinted into us so heavily that we just, you know, are on autopilot. And then we elaborate professions of love, you know, and this can cause us to not really know ourselves. What it really takes to thrive in a relationship is healing from our past, healing our imprints. And this is, you know, our friends, you know, our friendships, and also family members, if it's possible. Sometimes when there's trauma, family members have got no interest in the healing game. They, you know, they'll just project, and there's something wrong with you, and you're the black sheep or the wolf or whatever, you know, that can happen. We need to own our own triggers, which is part of the Pete Walker Complex PTSD book, but we need to understand what they are and what the fight, flight, freeze, fawn is. And then having hard conversations, you know, not just with ourselves, but with others as well. And that doesn't mean, you know, being unkind, but it means being able to, you know, have those hard conversations and not be afraid of confrontation, and to be able to look objectively at ourselves and the situations that we're in, and sometimes the situations we're creating, also the situations that we did not create as a child. So we need to let go of any guilt and shame around that. And the next slide is the book. So now I'm going to read Self-Compassionate Reparenting a little bit, not the whole chapter, but a little bit. So I'm going to read something that it starts with, this chapter, and it's by Carl Jung. There's a bit more before this, but I like this particular one. In every adult there lurks a child, an eternal child, something that is always becoming. It is never completed and calls for the unceasing care, attention, and education. That is the part of the human personality which wants to develop and become whole. So we're always going to have this inner child. It's not going to go anywhere, and we need to nurture that. So Pete Walker says, self-compassionate reparenting is a term I have coined to describe my approach to remothering and refathering the inner child. When we practice self-compassionate reparenting, we identify and provide for the unmet needs of our childhood so that we can grow into a more complete, life-loving human beings. Self-reparenting rescues us from being needlessly frozen in an old childhood of fear and deprivation. When we understand how childhood abuse and neglect left us developmentally arrested, empathy naturally arises and motivates us to care and protect ourselves. As this occurs, we commonly discover that our maturation process was suspended at various different stages of development, and that we have a number of inner children awaiting our kindness and protection. Among these are the inner infant, the inner toddler, and the inner preschooler, and so on. These distinctions are important because children have different needs at different developmental stages, and these correspond with a variety of different reparenting tasks. So you might see that if you think, you know, you're a 2-year-old, you're a 5-year-old, you're a 7-year-old, an 8-year-old. Each stage is different, and we have all of those different stages inside of us. Many survivors are uncomfortable with the concept of the inner child because they were forced at an early age to become miniature adults and to hate their childlike characteristics as much as their parents did. Survivors who do not like their inner children, or children in general for that matter, are often those who were not liked as children. So when your parents don't like you, or when we're not liked or loved and we're not mirrored back to in a kind way, or we're disdained or devalued and depreciated, it depreciates us. So then we have what's been mirrored back to us, we internalize that. It becomes an interject. And we internalize that, and then we live that way inside ourselves until we understand what's going on. So this inner work is highly important for us to evolve and get to some peace, inner peace. Pete Walker goes on to say, Many of us were so traumatized for being and acting childlike that we had to move from toddlerhood to adulthood in astoundingly brief periods of time. Various combinations of shame, punishment, and abandonment were forced to forfeit childhood and to act like grown-ups even before we were ready for school. He goes on here to say that Hal and Sidra Stone elaborate on this. He's talking about a couple who written a book. Perhaps the most universally disowned self in our civilized world is the vulnerable child. Yet this vulnerable child may be our most precious sub-personality, the closest to our essence, the one that enables us to become truly intimate, to fully experience others and to love. So we can see there are so many loveless adults around, walking around with a dead child inside of them, metaphorically, like, just a child that had no joy. And we replay this, I know, people that are just, the people that are just grumpy. They just can't take a joke, can't have fun, very hard on themselves, don't see the good in life, and, have problems in all areas of life, at home, at work. And I've been there as well. So I'm not pointing fingers here, it's, and then also the disassociation, the use of alcohol and drugs or overeating to stuff down or over shopping, or also pornography, the overuse of pornography can be ways that we disassociate. So we need to, and this takes time. So when you hear this information, don't think you're 40, don't think there's something wrong with you. Know that we're all going through this life learning, and it's very hard world out there. There's a lot of messed upness, and it's to do with the patriarchal rules that we've all been stuffed, that have been forced down our throats, and the belief systems. If we go back to the Bible and Adam and Eve, like Eve was in the story of where Lilith was concerned in the mythology, would not lay below Adam. And so Lilith was outcast as a wicked woman. So, the shadow side of us has been shamed as well. And we all have a shadow. And a shadow is something that, for better or for worse, we need to be able to look and take stock of our own lives. And it's not an easy task. So I'm here to help on that information. That's what I'm doing here. And through my evolutionary astrology as well, looking at imprints. And Pete Walker goes on to say, when a child is not allowed to be a child, she abandons herself, her child self, and him as well, we will add that, and banishes it to her unconscious and tries to behave like an adult. Many of us find it difficult to get an authentic sense of our inner child because the part of ourselves is still hiding somewhere out of awareness, much like the actual child who had to hide in closets or bedrooms to escape abuse. The child self often stays sequestered in the unconscious because the adult survivor, like the biological parents, reviles in whenever it emerges into the awareness, seeking help or attention. Inner children everywhere languish in the unconscious, awaiting for compassion for their terrible plight. Self-compassionate reparenting begins with the decision to love our inner children and protect them from self-abuse. As with healthy parenting, self-compassionate reparenting is a complex, multidimensional task, the full exploration of which is outside the scope of this book. More global information on self-reparenting is contained in Jeremy Abrams' excellent collection of writings on the subject, Reclaiming the Inner Child. So I don't have that book, but I'll make a note to look at that one as well, to pass more information out there. So for the purposes of becoming more fully feeling, we will focus here primarily on the emotional tasks of the reparenter. These constellate around two crucial goals for the recovery and ongoing development of our inborn sense of self-acceptance and the re-establishment and strengthening of our instinctive sense of self-protection. I find it useful to label these two tasks as self-mothering and self-fathering respectively. There are two reasons for this. The first is that this somewhat specious distinction helps clarify the differences between the two key processes of emotional caretaking: unconditional love and unrelenting self-protection. So, traditionally a mother would be unconditional love, and then the unrelenting self-protection would be the father, which has its roots in the emotion of anger. The second is that the inner child often expects to receive these two different types of emotional support along traditional gender lines. Although these distinctions are sexist and false, the inner child is often not capable of being politically correct about them. He often dreams of having a mummy who is tender and a daddy who stands up for him. Once again, I make the distinction as a teaching aid, and whether or not you find it useful, you can become your own key source of both loving tenderness and fierce protectiveness, regardless of your gender. Men can imagine themselves rocking or breastfeeding their inner infant, just as a woman can imagine themselves fighting off anyone who is threatening to their inner child. This is similar to what occurs in functional family. Both biological parents share in the mothering and fathering of their children, and both move easily and flexibly between the roles of tenderness and strength. I am happy and heartened to say that many of my friends who are parents moving towards a greater balance in these roles. So this goes on to the next section, which is reparenting begins with the forgiving of the inner child. I'm not going to go into that bit today, but I hope this gives you an idea of what this book is about, and that you can purchase a copy and begin to do that inner work. And if you need help, then do by means, you can book a session with me. Thanks for watching.